All right, this video is for my American history students, and we're starting this year off with Civil War. And so basically, I just want to introduce section one for you. You should be reading that and taking notes over it, but I'm just going to record this lecture to kind of help you out just a little bit, okay? So there's been a lot of build up to the Civil War. It's been a long time coming, probably at least 50, 60, 70 years in the making, okay? But for our purposes, we're going to start with the firing on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federally owned garrison in the South. And when Lincoln became president and the South decided that they were going to secede, they started taking back all of these forts. Well, they basically surround Fort Sumter, and they make it where no food can get in. They want the North to fire the first shot. But Lincoln has outwitted Jefferson Davis, his counterpart, the president of the Confederate States of America. And instead of fighting for the fort, he just basically sends in food to supply the fort so that they could stay there for as long as they wanted to. So this forced Jefferson Davis's hand, and he fires on Fort Sumter April 12th, 1861. This begins the Civil War, and Jefferson Davis was always very angry that it was the South that started the war, because they felt like it was really the North that was being the aggressors. Okay, well, this also plays well in the press, and Lincoln issues a call immediately after the firing on Fort Sumter for 75,000 volunteers. He actually gets 150,000 volunteers there. It really helps unite the North. They're very unhappy that they've been attacked, if you will. Meanwhile, by this time, you have 11 southern states who have seceded, including Arkansas. And you even have the creation of a new state called West Virginia. Virginia votes to secede from the Union, but in the West, up in the hill country, a bunch of hillbillies up there, coal miners, that kind of stuff, they had no use for slaves, and they didn't want to leave the United States of America to fight for slavery, something that meant nothing to them. Very poor blue-collar people in West Virginia. So you had the creation of a new state there. Both sides, at the beginning of this thing, believe that this war is going to be a very short war. Southerners believe that there were 3 or 4 Yankees. Yankees look down on the South and think there's no way that they could possibly beat them in a war. So both sides think this thing's going to happen very quickly. They're both wrong. Now, both sides have advantages, but clearly, if you look at it on paper, the North has the biggest, most important advantages. But we're going to list some of the South's advantages first, something that kind of keeps this war dragging on for the 4 years that it does, from 1861 to 1865. The South has a stronger military tradition. Most of this is because a few decades before, when we fought with Mexico, it was mostly Southern men, because the war with Mexico was kind of seen as being a war about spreading slavery and gaining new cotton lands such as Texas and even California. So they had some military tradition where Northerners decided they weren't going to fight in that war. So they didn't have any military tradition. The South had the greatest generals overall. They had more good generals than the North did. And probably the biggest advantage of all for the South was the fact that they were fighting a defensive war, kind of like us in Vietnam. How does Vietnam beat America? Well, we were fighting on their turf to take their homeland away from them, and that's what kept the South going. The North was invading them, not the other way around. Lastly, another advantage was King Cotton. That meant that there was some wealth in the South, even though they weren't technically as wealthy as the North by this time, because industry had made the North very powerful and very wealthy. King Cotton was going to help the South for at least for a little while. Advantages for the North, you got to make sure you know these advantages. For the North, without a doubt, they had a much superior population. They had quite a few more people than the South did. Bigger than that was the fact that they had so many industries. The South had very few industries. The North could churn out weapons, guns, trains. Railroads were a huge advantage. There were very few rails in the South, and most of those traveled to the North, because that's the relationship that had existed for a long time, was that the South provided raw materials that would be processed in the North, and then the North would turn around and sell those materials back to the South. Okay. Now, you must know something called the Anaconda Plan. Like the snake, they were going to squeeze the South in this vice grip, okay? 3 parts to the Anaconda Plan. You must remember them. The first was that they were going to blockade southern ports. They didn't want the South trading with England, because that would keep the southern economy viable. So if they could keep English ships from getting in or southern ships from getting out, then they would strangle the economy of the South. Secondly, they wanted to split the Mississippi River. If they took control of the Mississippi River, that would split the Confederacy in two parts. Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana would be on the western side and would not be able to be reinforced by the other part of the South. So that was a big part of the Anaconda Plan. Lastly, of course, they wanted to capture the capital of Richmond, Virginia. Interestingly enough, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia were only about 100 miles apart. So the two capitals of these rival nations were very close. All right. So after Fort Sumter, which we're not really considering Fort Sumter like a battle, okay? It's an event. The first real true battle of the Civil War was one called Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas by the South. They called it a different name. This happened only like 25, 30 miles outside of Washington, D.C. In fact, Northerners, even though Maryland is in the South, they're Union people. Okay, so all these people from Washington, D.C. go out, and the battle's taking place down in this little valley, and there's this big hill overlooking the place. They go out, and they set up a picnic. They think the Union troops are going to smash the hillbillies from the South, these rednecks from the South, and they were very wrong. This is where a very famous Southern general named Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, gets his name. The Union troops sent wave after wave against him, and there he was, standing like a stone wall against their attack. So he gets his nickname there. This is a huge rout for the North. They're ran off the field. The picnic becomes this frenzied thing. Unfortunately, the battle, and both sides are inexperienced, okay? The battle is so chaotic that the South is not able to push their advantage. They should have marched into Washington, D.C. and taken it. It was only 25 miles away, but they were so exhausted and kind of bewildered at their first true taste of battle that they did not. They chose to stop. Who knows what would have happened if they would have taken the capital of Washington, D.C. History could have been very different. Now, the overall commander for the Union forces at this time was a man named George McClellan. And what you got to know about George McClellan is he's far too cautious. He's always worried about losing men. And he always thinks the South is stronger than it actually is. And that's actually going to be worse for the war effort because it's going to keep this war going on when the North probably could have ended it several times. Another commander you must know for the North, the Union, was U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. He's the big. He will become the big dog later on. And you got to know the Civil War was really fought in two parts: the Western Theater and the Eastern Theater. Grant is in the West, and he is pretty dominant out there. He won some major victories at Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, and then a major victory at the bloody Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee. Some 25,000 American casualties there at that battle, but the Union is triumphant. Another guy that you need to know is David Farragut. And what's important about David Farragut, he is part of the Union fleet, and he is sailing down the Mississippi, and he makes it all the way to, he's able to get past Confederate forts that are firing upon him. He gets his fleet all the way to the south, and he takes New Orleans, which is important. Now, if they can take a couple other places along the Mississippi River, then they can realize one of their goals of the Anaconda Plan, which is to split the Confederacy in two. And that will happen in a couple more years. You must also know that there are many new weapons of the Civil War. Ironclad ships make their first appearance. The most famous battle, of course, was between the Monitor and the Merrimac. The Merrimac was the southern ship, later renamed the Virginia. Monitor was the ship for the Union. And basically, they have it out there in the river, but because they're iron-plated, the cannonballs just bounce off of each other, and so it's a draw. Neither one can sink the other. But it does kind of usher in a new age of ironclad ships. The most destructive new weapon of the Civil War, without a doubt, is the rifle and the minie ball. You remember the old movies where you watch people marching in lines like in Washington's time, colonial times, and they basically shoot at each other with a single-shot musket. Well, the rifle is far deadlier. It can be shot from a greater distance, and because they bore out the ends of the gun, the rifle is very accurate, and so the death toll is staggering. And in the beginning, they haven't adopted different techniques to make up for this different technology. Later on, they will not fight in no straight lines because they know to do so is suicide. Now, going back to the Eastern Theater of the war, you have McClellan versus Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee really wipes the floor up with McClellan for the most part. McClellan being too cautious, Lee is not. Lee is everything that you want in a general. He's basically a mythological hero to Southerners, and really still is to this day. Now, Lee makes a march on Washington, D.C., and unfortunately for him, there's a stroke of bad luck. He has his army, him and Stonewall Jackson, who's part of his army, are split at the moment. And they have orders. He wraps these orders around these cigars that get dropped out in the field. And some northern reconnaissance men find them, so they know their plans. This helps them gain an advantage in the battle that comes. The battle, known as Antietam, is the single bloodiest day in American history. More Americans, there were 26,000 casualties that day. That's the highest casualty count of any battle in American history. That includes World War I and World War II. So that's pretty crazy when you think about it, okay? So right here at Antietam. But it is a northern victory, so it does repulse Lee out of the north there for a little bit. McClellan does not pursue. McClellan should have followed Lee and destroyed his army, but McClellan was a little bit scared and a little bit too overcautious, and so he doesn't, and he allows Lee to regroup, and it's going to make this war last for 3 more years. It will be this action at Antietam that will get McClellan fired by President Lincoln. Now, McClellan holds a grudge, and he'll end up running for president against Lincoln in '64. Obviously, he doesn't win, but there's some bad blood there. But anyway, that's section 1. We have begun the Civil War. You've seen the advantages of both sides, the North and the South. You see some missteps out of generals that will kind of keep this war going on longer than it ever should have. And we'll explore some more things next in section 2. Thank you.